Little Pigeon Creek, Indiana, October 1818. A 9-year-old boy sits beside his mother's bed and watches her die, slowly, over several days, and there is nothing anyone in that cabin can do about it. She trembles, she vomits, her breath comes shallow and sour. A neighbor who knows a little more medicine than most is sent for, but even she has no real answer, only a name for it that explains nothing: the milk-sick. There is no doctor within reach who could have saved her, and no doctor anywhere in the country, in truth, who understood what was actually killing her. Her husband will build her coffin himself, because on the Indiana frontier in 1818, that is simply what a man does when his wife dies and there is no one else to do it. The boy's name is Abraham Lincoln. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was 34 years old. She had also nursed her aunt and uncle through the same illness in the weeks before her own death, in the same small settlement, without anyone around her understanding that the household was in any particular danger until it was already far too late. Abraham's father, Thomas, remarried the following year, and the boy grew up carrying the loss forward, later by most biographical accounts, rarely speaking of it directly, though those who knew him often noted a certain reserve about death that friends traced back to that single autumn. This is the story of a disease that quietly killed thousands of people across the American frontier for more than 100 years, that doctors never solved, and that was only ever figured out by the ordinary people who actually lived and died alongside it. A quick warning before we go further: this one is grim, and every word of it is true, including the part where the woman who eventually solved it was laughed out of medical circles for decades, while the very doctors dismissing her kept quietly writing "cause unknown" on death certificates for children they'd watched die the exact same way. Milk sickness, or the trembles, as it was often called on the frontier, was never one single dramatic outbreak. It was a slow, recurring terror that settled over certain patches of land, sometimes for a single bad season, sometimes for years at a stretch, and then, just as unpredictably, seemed to lift. A family could live for a decade in a place with no trouble at all, and then lose a child, a parent, half a household, within the space of a few weeks, for reasons nobody around them could explain. The symptoms followed a grim, fairly consistent pattern. First came weakness and a distinctive trembling, especially in the legs. Then loss of appetite, severe constipation, and a sweetish, unusual odor on the breath that some frontier accounts described almost like the smell of acetone. Vomiting followed, then abdominal pain, then a creeping stupor that could deepen over anywhere from a few days to 2 weeks into coma and death. In children especially, the disease could move with terrifying speed. What made it so much harder to fight than an ordinary epidemic was that it never behaved like one. It didn't spread from person to person. Neighbors could nurse a dying family member for days without ever falling ill themselves. And it wasn't obviously tied to dirty water or crowded housing. The usual suspects 19th century medicine already had rough theories about. Whatever this was, it seemed to strike almost at random, cabin by cabin, and doctors of the era, working entirely within the framework of germ theory that hadn't even fully arrived yet, had no real tools to explain it. Frontier physicians of the early 1800s were, in fairness, working with a genuinely thin toolkit. Miasma theory, the idea that disease arose from foul air given off by decaying matter, still dominated a great deal of medical thinking, and where that failed to explain something, doctors often reached for older humoral traditions inherited largely intact from centuries earlier, treating illness as an imbalance to be corrected through bleeding, purging, or blistering rather than a specific external agent to be identified. Milk sickness fit none of these frameworks cleanly. It didn't correlate with swamps or bad air. It didn't respond to the standard treatments. Physicians tried blaming contaminated well water, tried blaming the heat of late summer, tried blaming a kind of localized environmental poison seeping up from the soil itself, and each theory in turn failed to hold up against the actual pattern of who fell ill and who didn't. Entire seasons of a country doctor's career could pass without producing anything closer to an answer than a Latin name for the symptoms. The regions hit hardest tended to share a particular kind of geography: heavily wooded, recently settled land where cattle grazed freely at the forest's edge rather than on cleared, managed pasture. Southern Ohio in particular, and Highland County especially, became so severely and repeatedly affected across the 1820s and 30s that local historical accounts describe entire stretches of settlement essentially depopulated by it, families packing up and moving further west or south simply to escape land that seemed cursed, without ever understanding that the curse was standing quietly in their own pasture the whole time. Parts of Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee saw similar, if less extensively documented, waves of the same unexplained mortality. The actual cause, as we now understand it, had nothing to do with contagion at all. It came from a plant. White snakeroot, a modest, unremarkable-looking woodland flower, grows wild across much of the eastern and midwestern United States, particularly in the shaded margins of forests and pastures. The plant contains a toxin called tremetol, and cattle that grazed on it in wooded areas, especially during dry seasons when other forage was scarce, absorbed that toxin into their own systems. The animals themselves would develop a version of the same trembling that gave the human disease its folk name, which is precisely why frontier communities called it the trembles long before anyone connected it formally to people. But an affected cow didn't need to die, or even look particularly sick, to pass the poison onward. Tremetol concentrated in the animal's milk and meat, and a family drinking that milk, day after ordinary day, could absorb a slow, cumulative dose of a poison they had absolutely no way of detecting in a substance they trusted more than almost anything else they consumed. This is precisely what made the disease so resistant to any 19th century medical explanation. The victims weren't eating anything unusual. They were drinking milk, the most basic, wholesome staple of frontier life, from cows that might look and behave completely normally most of the time. The poisoning depended on where exactly the cattle happened to graze, how much white snakeroot grew in that particular pasture that particular season, and how dry the summer had been, since cattle were far more likely to browse in the shaded woods where the plant grew when open pasture grass was scarce. None of that was visible to a family filling a pail at the barn each morning. For a disease this quietly devastating, medical science, working from hospitals and universities far from the affected regions, made remarkably little progress toward understanding it. It would ultimately fall to a woman almost entirely outside that formal medical establishment to work out the answer. Her name was Anna Pierce Hobbs, later Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby, a frontier healer practicing in rural Illinois in the 1830s in a region badly and repeatedly affected by milk sickness. She had already lost people close to her to the disease, and unlike most of the physicians of her era, she had the advantage of watching it unfold, again and again, directly on the ground, among cattle and families she personally knew. According to the most commonly told version of this story, Anna Pierce was shown the plant responsible by a Shawnee healing woman, sometimes remembered locally simply as Aunt Shawnee, who recognized white snakeroot from her own community's accumulated knowledge of the local landscape. Indigenous communities across this region had lived alongside these same plants for generations, and very plausibly understood the danger of certain woodland browse long before any European settler arrived to ask. The full historical record of exactly how that knowledge passed between the two women is thin, filtered mostly through frontier recollection rather than contemporary documentation, but the outcome that followed is well attested. Anna Pierce set out to test the theory herself, with the crude but genuinely scientific tools available to a rural healer with no laboratory. She penned a calf specifically in an area thick with white snakeroot, restricting its diet to that plant, and watched it develop the unmistakable trembling associated with the disease. It was, in essence, a controlled experiment conducted with a single fenced animal on a frontier homestead, decades before formal toxicology existed as a discipline in the United States. By most retellings, she brought neighbors out to see the animal for themselves, standing at the fence and watching a healthy calf, isolated from every other possible cause, developed the exact same trembling gait that had preceded so many human deaths in the same county, as direct and immediate a demonstration as anyone without a laboratory could possibly offer. Milk sickness was, in this sense, far from unique. The 19th century is full of slow-burning medical mysteries that turned out to have a single environmental cause hiding in plain sight, misread for decades because doctors kept looking for a contagion where none existed. Lead poisoning from pewter tableware and water pipes produced a bewildering, seemingly unrelated collection of symptoms across the Western world for generations before anyone connected them back to a single metal. Ergotism, caused by a fungus growing on rye, was blamed on witchcraft, divine punishment, and mass hysteria in different centuries and different countries before anyone traced it back to contaminated grain. In each case, including this one, the actual solution turned out to be almost absurdly physical and local: a specific plant, a specific metal, a specific fungus, sitting directly in the path of the people suffering from it, invisible mainly because nobody with the authority to be believed was looking in the right direction. She spent years afterward trying to warn her community and push the medical establishment to take the findings seriously. By most accounts, she was met largely with dismissal. She was a woman working outside any formal medical credential in a rural region far from the universities and academies where 19th century American medicine considered itself to reside, making a claim that ran directly against prevailing theories about disease. Unwilling to simply let the matter drop, Anna Pierce eventually pursued the very credentials that had been used to dismiss her, traveling to attend medical lectures and, by several regional accounts, eventually earning formal recognition as a physician herself later in life, one of a genuinely small number of women in American medicine to do so in that era. She continued practicing in Illinois for decades, treating patients directly with the knowledge she had assembled largely on her own, while the broader medical establishment continued, for the most part, to regard white snake root as an unproven folk theory rather than a settled cause. Local communities that took her warning seriously reportedly began clearing snake root from pastures and fencing cattle away from wooded grazing land well before any formal scientific study existed to justify the practice, and in those specific communities, by multiple local accounts, milk sickness cases measurably declined. It would take the better part of a century after her original discovery for the medical and scientific establishment to formally, chemically confirm what she had already worked out with a single fenced calf. That formal confirmation came only in the early 20th century, when researchers, working with the analytical chemistry tools of the era, finally isolated tremetol from white snake root and demonstrated conclusively that it was the toxin responsible for both the animal trembles and human milk sickness. The chemistry itself turned out to be genuinely difficult to pin down, since tremetol is not a single simple compound, but a mixture of related toxic substances present in wildly varying concentrations depending on the plant's growing conditions, which helps explain why earlier, cruder attempts at analysis kept producing inconsistent results, and why the mystery dragged on for as long as it did even after suspicion had already settled on the right plant. By then, the disease had already been quietly killing people across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and other frontier and early Midwestern states for more than 100 years. The human cost across that century is difficult to state with precision because so many of the deaths were simply recorded as fever or stomach complaint or cause unknown, scattered across county records that were never compiled into any unified national count. But regional historians studying affected communities have documented settlements where milk sickness killed such a substantial fraction of residents in a single bad season that some frontier communities were abandoned outright, their surviving families simply moving on rather than continuing to farmland that seemed, for reasons nobody could explain, to be killing them. Long before anyone understood the actual mechanism, many frontier communities developed their own rough, practical folk knowledge around it, entirely independent of formal medicine. Certain pastures came to be quietly avoided, passed down as local law. A specific stretch of woods a family simply didn't let cattle graze, without anyone necessarily being able to say exactly why beyond, "That's where the trembles come from." Some communities noticed correctly that late summer and early autumn, when other forage had dried out and cattle wandered further into the woods looking for anything green, seemed to bring a noticeably higher risk and shifted grazing patterns accordingly, again without any formal understanding of what they were actually protecting against. This kind of accumulated, unofficial local knowledge, built from generations of watching, which fields seemed to kill people and which didn't, would turn out, once the science finally caught up, to have been substantially correct the entire time. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the mother from that cabin in Indiana, was one name among many thousands, most of whom left no trace in any historical record beyond a scattered family grave and a county ledger listing cause of death as simply unknown. What made her case different was not the disease itself, which behaved exactly as it always did, but the fact that the 9-year-old boy who watched her die would spend the rest of his life in a position where his own biography eventually became a matter of intense public interest, carrying this one detail of frontier suffering into the historical record almost by accident. Once cattle husbandry in the affected regions modernized, once pastures were cleared of white snakeroot and dairy herds were increasingly kept on managed grazing land rather than allowed to forage freely in wooded areas. Milk sickness declined sharply through the later 19th and early 20th centuries. It never entirely disappeared. Isolated cases tied to unusual grazing conditions or unpasteurized milk from free-ranging animals have continued to appear even into relatively recent decades, occasionally still catching a modern physician off guard precisely because the disease has become so rare that it no longer sits anywhere near the top of anyone's diagnostic checklist. Veterinary and public health authorities in affected states still monitor for white snakeroot in pasture land today, treating it now as a well-understood, manageable agricultural hazard rather than the mysterious, unstoppable killer it once was. A complete reversal made possible only by the exact knowledge that took the medical establishment 100 years to accept. What lingers, more than the disease itself, is the shape of how it was actually solved. Not in a laboratory, not by a credentialed physician working from established medical theory, but by a woman on the literal edge of the American frontier, building on knowledge that very likely originated with an indigenous community whose understanding of the local landscape had simply never been considered worth formally recording. It took the people who lived closest to the problem to solve it, and it took the institutions furthest from that problem the better part of a century to admit they were right. There is a broader, uncomfortable pattern hiding inside this particular story, one that shows up again and again across the history of medicine whenever formal science finally catches up to knowledge that ordinary people working close to the actual problem had already quietly assembled for themselves. The credentials that were supposed to make medical knowledge more reliable, in this case, mostly succeeded in making it slower, adding a full century of otherwise avoidable deaths onto a mystery that a fenced calf and a healer with no formal training had already solved. Dr. Marrow. Subscribe, and next time someone with no formal credentials tells you they've figured something out that all the experts have missed, maybe check the pasture before you dismiss them.